Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Empirical Study of Gender workshop in Pakistan. This year, CERP's EGEN workshop has been designed and executed in collaboration with the World Bank's CLEAR initiative and the Institute for Development and Economic Alternatives. And we're extremely delighted to have prominent policy actors who have worked a lot on women's related issues in Pakistan, ranging from political participation to women's legal and social rights. And we also have an esteemed group of researchers who lead gender-based projects at organizations like CERP and IDEAS. We have with us Dr. Kate Wiborny, who's Associate Director, DevLab at Duke, and who's also the lead PI for a few of our women-related research projects at CERP. We also have with us Dr. Sarah Khan, who's Assistant Professor of Political Science at Yale. We have Dr. Rabia Malik, who is the CEO and Research Fellow at the Institute of Development and Economic Alternatives, and she's also going to be our moderator for both the panel discussions. And we have Mariam Khan, who's another Research Fellow at IDEAS. Before we officially kickstart our workshop, I will just want to go over a few of our housekeeping points. So this is a hybrid event where some of our panelists and participants are joining us on Zoom. So for our in-person participants, I would like to request everyone to please put your cell phones on silent. If you have to take a call or make one, you can please step outside so that we don't disturb the proceedings in here. And if you want to get directions to the restroom or the prayer areas, you can approach the CERP organizing committee. So there's Faizan at the back and Jahanara, so you can please raise your hands. And similarly, if you have any questions or opinions that you want to share during the panel discussions Q&A, please raise your hand and we'll have somebody provide you with a mic so that you can contribute to the conversation. For our online participants, because we want this to be a very interactive and engaging day today, we would encourage all of you to have your videos switched on for the entire duration of the event. And if you want to participate, you can use the raise hand feature on Zoom, or you can even type up your question or your message on the chat window, and we will make sure that you have the floor to share your opinions. And please keep yourself on mute so that there's no background noise while you're not speaking. So it is my absolute honor to now welcome the President and CEO of the Center for Economic Research in Pakistan, Maroof Syed, who's also a senior fellow and advisor at Harvard's Evidence for Policy Design, to come in and give the opening remarks to share his thoughts on what the objectives and purpose of this workshop are.
Thank you, Anam. So first of all, welcome everybody. I think we have a few participants online as well, so it's wonderful to see everyone sort of dialed in at the right time. I just wanted to take a few moments, and I'm really excited to actually hear the panelists and all the discussion that we're about to have. So it's not going to be a long, opening remarks, but I wanted to share a few things with you. Number one, I wanted to first of all congratulate both, Dr. Kate Wiborny and Dr. Sarah Khan for doing a wonderful job on day one of this workshop, which was really centered around academic exchange. So one of the key things about this workshop is that on day one, there's a really rich academic exchange between senior researchers, but also younger researchers, and just creating that collaborative environment. And then day two, which is what I'm going to briefly talk about, bringing in policy actors and really focusing on the fact that we want better take-up of evidence in the policy domain, right? And so here, I wanted to spend a little bit more time because I think this is really crucial, and CERP has come a long way in really building a research platform But we really are going to push more and more on the policy side and really focus on how we can deploy our research. And that, it's not just CERP, but, ideas and other institutions that are doing great work in Pakistan. How can we collaboratively push on the policy side and really methodically approach evidence take-up? Because I think we have to be able to create an environment where we can deploy our research insights. And I think I would sort of say that there are three challenges around it. One is there's definitely an action bias in the government, right? I mean, in government, there's a lot of firefighting that happens. And then certainly the state capability, can they really absorb the information? But it's actually a twofold thing.
Recording in progress.
Where on one side, yes, we often say, we focus on the state capability. Can they consume the research? Can they consume the evidence that we're talking about? But I think there's a greater responsibility on our side to actually make it consumable and to really sort of think about that beyond publications and beyond academic audiences, can we reach out to a broader set of people? So at CERP, we have really started to push on policy advisory, which is a complete separate vertical. But the idea is to really deploy the research, deploy the insights that we have generated from our work. And I think to that point, I'm really excited, and I think we're very lucky to have Dr. Rachel Glennerster here. And Rachel was really, it's really nice of you to fly up here to Lahore for a day and deal with the heat as well, both in Karachi and Lahore. But I think I'm really excited to also hear her speak, because I think certainly I couldn't think of anyone better who could really capture the academic side as well as the policy side of things, right? Having spent such a long time at both DFID and also from the third lens, leading JPAL. So with that, I want to actually really welcome her to Lahore and to CERP and this workshop. And I think we will have Kate and Rabia talk about specific research projects at CERP and ideas now.
Thank you so much, Maruf, and thank you everyone for being here. We're really excited to have a really good set of conversations today about some of the work that's been going on by CERP and ideas over recent years that's relevant to women's well-being and empowerment, and what we can do in terms of concrete policy changes going forward to use the evidence base that's been generated. Is this thing going to drive? Hopefully. Okay, excellent. So I have just, I think, 5 or 10 minutes to give a whirlwind overview of projects related to gender at CERP, the Center for Economic Research in Pakistan. Some of these are projects I'm involved in, and some of them are projects I'm not involved in. This is just a taster. So in the subsequent sessions after the keynote, we're going to have a much more in-depth discussion on a smaller number of projects and their policy implications. Okay, so I put them in order from projects that are quite mature and have been going on for a long time to those that are just getting started, and we're very excited to see what their impacts are. So the first project that we wanted to highlight is the Punjab Economic Opportunities Project. This represents a collaboration between CERP and the government of Punjab, specifically intended to try to address the sort of economic well-being of households, and particularly women, in some of the poorest districts of South Punjab. It's been a huge collaboration that has involved a number of different randomized control trials in which CERP and the implementers, PSDF, Carvan, and other partners have collaborated to test out many different approaches to trying to build technical and vocational skills and increase market involvement of households and particularly women. A few key findings that have emerged from this stream of research are as follows. The PSDF and governments really worldwide in many developing countries invest a lot of resources into technical and vocational training to try to increase income and livelihoods for households and for women. But one of the key findings that's emerged from this set of interventions and the set of randomized controlled trials that have tested them out is that skills training alone, so interventions that just focus on provide the training and don't have anything to complement that, have had relatively limited impact on outcomes. On the other hand, when we do other things in combination with these skills trainings, it's had a much greater impact. So when women are not just trained on how to undertake tailoring work, but also linked to the market, they're more likely to both engage in tailoring activity and also increase their skills. So they learn more when it's training plus an opportunity to sell to the market. Another finding that's come out of this kind of set of RCTs is that villages that received a training center saw take-up rates much higher than those that did not. So just providing training somewhere in the area may not be enough to really increase and enhance the technical and vocational skills of women. Rather, it's really a challenge for them to reach the training center. And so when the research team tested out interventions to make it easier for women to reach the training locations, that also help to increase take-up. So this long-running partnership has provided a lot of insights that are relevant for not just PSDF, but for vocational and technical training interventions across the board in Pakistan and in other countries to understand what are, on a practical level, what else do we need to do besides just create the training and make it available to take participants all the way from just having access to this training to actually taking up the training, learning the skills, and accessing and sort of getting involved in economically productive activities. A second set of projects that we wanted to highlight is the Women's Mobility Program and labor market research agenda via job search platform. So this is a project that's kind of grown over time. This is one that I am involved in. And it's been going on since 2014. So in this project, we've developed a job search facilitation and matching service in which we have over 13,000 job seekers and 1,200 employers. We partnered with several different Punjab government agencies, including the Commission on the Status of Women and the Social Welfare Department, to expand the access to this service to young women in institutes of higher education, as well as with survivors of domestic violence and people with disabilities. In the context of this platform, we have been again, testing and piloting different kinds of interventions, the goal of which is to try to increase job search and increase access to the labor market for people, and in particular for women. So one of the first projects that come out of this platform that really kind of tells us about the impact of a particular intervention is one in which we've offered safe transport to work, and what we find is that increases job search dramatically for women and not for men. So women are really subject, kind of resonating with the findings from the PIOP project that I mentioned earlier. Women are really constrained by safe mobility in a way that men are not, and that makes a difference to their ability to participate in job search and to participate in the labor market. On this platform, we have a number of other randomized control trials in progress, which are going to test different interventions and how they can help people access, and in particular help to reduce the gender gap in labor force participation, including a set of interventions to try to help bridge the digital divide in women's job search. We know that women have less access, independent access to cell phones and less access to information in this context, and so we're testing different approaches to help the information flow about potential job opportunities to participants in these studies to see what can be most effective in helping them access this information. A third study we wanted to highlight is an ongoing project related to social norms around child marriage. So this project is intended to understand if we want to reduce child marriage, who should we really be talking to? What's the target audience that would be most effective, that we should reach to be most effective in combating child marriage? In this study, the researchers conduct a randomized trial of a mobile cinema educational entertainment program, which raises awareness about child marriage and some of the negative consequences it can have. They've tested different approaches, whether targeting the intervention to women, men, or both together. So this picture shows an example of the kind of street theater type approach that then gets digitized and turned into this mobile, scalable intervention. So the preliminary findings of this study indicate that actually targeting women and targeting men both work, but in different ways. So targeting men turn out to be playing a key role in making decisions within their households. Targeting men reduces child marriage for girls in their own household. But on the other hand, targeting women reduces child marriage at the village level. So in either case, they're both effective in different ways. But from a policy perspective, a really exciting kind of implication of this is that child marriage, so girl child marriage can be reduced with this kind of low-cost, easily scalable intervention that doesn't have to go through schooling, and it can be replicated with this mobile technology at a large scale. The team is still working currently on doing more data analysis to try to understand potential unintended consequences that could happen, for example, backlash to this kind of message. So that's research that's ongoing. Fourth study that we wanted to highlight is one that tries to understand how can we reach out-of-school adolescent girls. So we know that young women drop out or withdrawn from the education system at quite high rates. This project tests and evaluates the impact of a remedial learning program. In this program, it's a 6-month curriculum for girls who've already dropped out of the formal education system. And the study is intended to understand what are the impacts of this intervention on enrollment, retention, learning outcomes, and non-cognitive skills. This is a project that's still in progress, so stay tuned for the results. Another project we're getting into more into the new and upcoming studies in this section of the presentation. So we have a couple that are focusing on maternal and infant health. In a new collaboration, CERP is playing a role in the rollout and testing of using a better form of nutritional supplements, MMS, multiple micronutrient supplements for maternal health. This is something that could be done within the government system at a very large scale. In basic health units all over the country, women already are being offered supplements for maternal health, but the potential that's been recognized here in existing evidence is that a more comprehensive supplement, MMS, can have better impacts on maternal and child outcomes than the supplements that are currently being used. So CERP is working with Kirk Humanitarian and with government partners to distribute MMS in selected districts and train basic health unit staff to test the impact of this new approach. And if it's successful, the goal is to fully transition the program to the government within 5 years. And ultimately, this could be used, mainstreamed into the standard of care within the public system for expectant mothers. Another project in the area of maternal and child health is one in which we are trying to address from a different direction the fact that Pakistan has, in fact, the world's highest neonatal mortality rate. It's thought that part of the reason for this is that there's very low rates of exclusive and early breastfeeding. So most people breastfeed, but they don't start immediately. They don't start within an hour after birth, as is the WHO recommendation. And they offer other foods or water which can be contaminated in addition to breast milk, which is unfortunately harmful for the infant's health. So in this project, we're aiming to improve maternal and child health by developing and piloting a training and mobile app for lady health workers, who are the community health workers who really move at the ground level from household to household, coaching and helping families as they go through the birth, especially of a first child. This is going to help them to troubleshoot more effectively when issues come up with breastfeeding, and remind them to start initiating the counseling process early before birth, so they start talking about feeding in advance. This is also planned to be studied as part of a randomized trial. The final set of projects I'm not going to talk about in detail now, because we are going to have a session on them in panel 2 later today. But just to give you a little preview, so we have a set of projects that are intended to understand what drives the gap between legal rights that women have on the books, on paper in the law, and what legal rights they actually access in practice in terms of marriage and inheritance. So I'm going to talk about those in more detail later on. So that's been a whirlwind tour of some, but not all, of the gender-relevant projects ongoing at CERP. And now I'd like to hand over to my colleague Rabia, who is going to give an overview of projects related to gender at Ideas.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about the work on gender at Ideas. So I'm just going to present an overview of the projects that our resident and associate fellows have going on, some of the themes that they cover, and then spotlight, very similarly to Kate, some of the projects that we have going. I'll hand over to my colleague Mariam to talk in particular about a project on women's social movements that she's leading with colleagues at IDS. So really, there's a range of projects that are looking at different aspects, including political participation, access to services, gender social norms, and how they shift. Sorry, this seems to be moving around. How they shift with education, and as more and more women gain education, stay for longer in schools, and progress to college. We also have projects that are evaluating the impact of multisectoral interventions at scale, some of which may be focused on poverty reduction and child health. And more recently, there's empirical work that's designed quite quickly during the pandemic to document the lived experience of women and young girls during COVID-19. So really, across the different projects, the research documents multidimensional constraints that women face in exercising life choices and in participating in various spheres, including the economic sphere, the social sphere, and the political sphere. But the research goes beyond that, beyond the descriptions of structural constraints, and generates knowledge about what works to expand freedoms for women and build their capabilities. And in doing so, I think it generates gender transformative, evidence for gender transformative programming for a variety of stakeholders, including practitioners, implementers, and policymakers. Another aspect to highlight is that this research is explicitly and intentionally multidisciplinary. We call on frameworks from across different disciplines for understanding the structural nature of these constraints. A variety of methods are at play, all the way from rigorous evaluations and experimental design studies to participatory qualitative methods. In fact, we're very interested in building a community of practice around empirical qualitative work. So we're very interested in partnerships with researchers and implementers that are interested in that kind of work that generates sort of contextual ground level empirical knowledge about microprocesses, strategic decisions that women make in households, etc., and what works to improve their empowerment. So just to spotlight some projects, very similarly, some that are more developed and that you'll hear about later today as well, and some that are in development and at the design stage. So this project that Sarah Khan and Ali Chima are working on with colleagues in partnership with Aurat Foundation and SAP-PK, looking at the civic and political pathways to participation. They've documented constraints to women's participation, and importantly, evaluated strategies for reducing gender gaps in voter turnout. So they've analyzed Election Commission of Pakistan's voter turnout data with a focus on the 2018 general elections. They've held focus groups and surveys to document reasons for the gender gaps, and deployed an RCT that tests the effectiveness of voter education and canvassing in Lahore. And they've generated knowledge about the extent and distribution of these gender gaps, about factors that limit political participation for women, and the invisibility of women in the political processes and to their political representatives. And one of the puzzling patterns that they do identify in voter turnout is that these gaps in voter turnout are highest in some of the urban metropolises in Pakistan. So Lahore, compared to its provincial average, Karachi, Peshawar, Quetta, compared to their provincial averages, represent higher gender gaps in voter turnout. So much fewer women in these cities come out to vote than the rest of the province. They've documented these patterns and others in a report titled The Empty Promise of Urbanization, if you want to look that up. They've identified also persistent patriarchal norms, relatively little knowledge about local politics and voting processes, and mobility constraints, particularly on the day of the election, as reasons for these gaps. But importantly and very interestingly, they've tested and generated evidence on the effectiveness and importance of targeting male gatekeepers. If you were to include male household members in campaigns to encourage women voters, you can reduce the gender gap they document by up to 8 percentage points. They've also built on the networks that they've set up during this time to go back to these households to document the lived experiences of the women during COVID-19. And they've published a series of blogs on what they found out in partnership with IDS on women's autonomy and shifts in women's autonomy, the shifts in burden to care, access to health services, etc. Another project that's crime policing and state building is an example of an adaptive project in that the focus on gender developed out of a recognition of women's de facto exclusion from community policing programming that was already in progress. This also gained some momentum after the passage of the 2016 Protection of Women Against Violence Act. So what they've tried to do is understand women's specific security demands, highlighted the challenges that designing a gender-responsive community policing program may have, and evaluated effectiveness of inclusive strategies, all using mixed methods. And again, generating quite interesting findings on the unmet demand for women-only spaces to have conversations such as this. And when they've held fora that are for women only, lots of women have come and they've been quite vocal about the kinds of demands they have from the police. They also find that women citizens are more likely to raise issues of gender-based violence, domestic and child abuse as policing priorities. And through the interaction with female colleagues, the male police officers have come to recognize that gender-based violence and domestic violence is a high priority issue for policing. But despite that, the reporting of gender-based crimes hasn't necessarily changed in the short run. So there's been an attitudinal shift, but the reporting hasn't yet changed, which has indicated a need for institutional police reforms to accompany community initiatives. And the good news is that actually there's also policy engagement on this front. So Ali Chima and Ehsan Zia Faruqi are members of the Police Reform Committee that's been constituted by the Special Monitoring Unit of the Chief Minister to design future reform and actions based on these learnings. Shifting gears a little bit to talk about projects in education and gender. So I'm involved with a study with colleagues at the bank and University of Illinois in Chicago to provide qualitative input into an RCT that investigates the effectiveness of text messages for reducing girls' dropouts post-COVID and for providing remote tutoring for those that demand it. So we've conducted phone interviews with girls, with their mothers, and with fathers. And these interviews have revealed mechanisms that have helped interpret some of the findings from the RCTs. We do find that older girls bear a disproportionately heavy burden of care within the household. They're more likely, their education is more likely to be interrupted. They're more likely also to take on tutoring roles for their younger siblings, etc., and for care roles for older members as well as younger members of the household. We're finding out that access to television and cell phones is policed and mediated by parents, particularly for the girls. There's also a cultural barrier or sorts at imagining television as a mode of education. So people are parents are not willing to allow use of television for girls even to be used as education. They don't think it can be done. So there's room, I think, for interaction there. The good news, the mothers have emerged as a huge champion for their daughters' education, engaging a lot of times in strategic negotiations within the household to make sure that their girls' educations continue, and also organizing support for tuition. The fathers are invested in their girls' education, and a majority have revealed that they did not consider withdrawing their girls during the repeated school closures that have happened. This is a project that is at the design stage in partnership with the Citizens Foundation. We're designing an intergenerational qualitative study to document the multidimensional impact of education on life trajectories. So we're interested in what happens as you leave school, as you become older, as you enter the labor market. And we want to do this in communities where the number of girls who are getting educated increased over time. So we're interested in documenting not just individual trajectories and changes in the capability sets of individuals, but also on gendered norms. So how do they shift? Who does education benefit? Does it leave somebody behind? Who is getting left behind? We're focusing on girls and boys. We're focusing on the impact on socioeconomic mobility, which so far I think for Pakistan has only been studied quantitatively and for men and sons. We want to look at the ways in which gendered social norms shift, but also factors that allow that to happen, to be able to generate information about, again, in addition to making schools and getting girls to them, what other kinds of things might we want to be thinking about to make sure they can realize the opportunities that education promises them. Just very quickly, there are some multisectoral interventions, and after Kate's presentation, I think we should have more conversations about some of these because I think there are a lot of complementarities. We want to look at, again, access to clean water, child and maternal health, how providing different kinds of inputs to the same households might result in outcomes that improve more than individual interventions and investments within the same households. There's qualitative work built within this RCT to document water management practices, caregiving practices, decisions regarding child nutrition, etc., but also the constraints that mothers face as primary carers. So I'll stop here and hand over to Mariam, actually, in interest of time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. I'm Mariam Khan from IDEAS, a colleague of Dr. Rabia's, a resident fellow there. I'm just going to share with you one particular project that we're working on right now. I cannot claim to match the speed and efficiency of Kate's whirlwind presentation and Rabia's very effective sort of rundown of all the work that IDEAS is doing. I'm just going to share with you some preliminaries of this one particular project that we're doing, which is heavily qualitative. Not going to be sharing any findings because there aren't any at the moment. So this is a 5-year multi-country study, and we've just wrapped up the second year. So what I'm going to do instead is really to give you a sense of the kinds of qualitative methods we're using and the kinds of questions that we're asking as part of the study, because I think it really stands out in terms of trying to privilege subjectivities, so subjective voices of the people that we're working with. And this is a project, it's called Sustaining Power for Women's Rights in South Asia. It goes by the very neat acronym SUPER. And we're collaborating on this with the Institute of Development Studies, IDS at Sussex. Just wanted to say a quick word about the co-researchers and the research team. All the other co-researchers are actually outside of IDEAS, which brings in a lot of interesting diversity because they're sort of located across Pakistan. Ayman Butcha is in Lahore, Sabah Aslam is in Karachi, and Jalila Haider is primarily between Islamabad and Quetta. So that really brings a very strong team into this project. What is this about? So this is a project which aims to actually run alongside people or women who are collectivizing around certain rights of theirs. It wants to try and map the struggle as it's going along, right? So we're trying to actually map struggles that are ongoing. These are not historical case studies. We're trying to actually see how women collectivize around their rights, what kinds of forms of collectivization they're able to pull together under some very difficult circumstances, for which, you know, the countries that we've included in this project are Pakistan, Nepal, India, and Bangladesh, the so-called patriarchal belt. So the idea here is to actually construct a very robust comparative framework across these countries to really try and understand how do women mobilize, how do they collectivize, how do they organize their struggles, which is why we tend to kind of move away from the nomenclature of social movements and use the term struggle instead, which is more expansive and sort of is more open-ended and allows for different kinds of perhaps quasi-organized collectives, which are not necessarily operating in more formal spaces that we're accustomed to thinking of. All right. So looking at active struggles, looking at forms of collectivization, and when we're looking at struggles and movements, we are typically also then looking at backlash. So also trying to understand what are the current conditions of backlash, what does contemporary backlash look like against various forms of women's struggles, and then to come to some kinds of observations and conclusions about how these struggles strategize around backlash. So what are their mechanisms and strategies in response to backlash? How do they sort of huddle back together in difficult conditions and re-strategize and go on? So the idea here was looking at case studies of positive deviance, which means that you look at struggles which are active and ongoing and have been able to survive through difficult conditions. So the core question here being, how do struggles actually sustain their gains and sustain their power? So we want to understand these cases of positive deviance, as it were. So in each country, we're looking at 4 spaces. Spaces, just not geographical spaces, but spaces in terms of where can we locate the gains of these struggles, right? So we've got the family space, community, market, and state, which means that we're looking at struggles in each of these spaces in each of the 4 countries, which actually means 16 case studies. And at the end of the 5 years, what we plan to do is to sit together and actually compare across these studies, across these spaces, to come to certain understandings and insights about whether we can actually abstract from these struggles and talk about how they survive, how they sustain their gains. And gains and power and all of that being very subjectively defined objectives. So we're not using any template that we're imposing on them. We're asking them to let us know what they feel their gains and power looks like, right? 1 minute, 2 minutes? 2 minutes, a couple of minutes. All right, so this is just a listing of the case studies that we're running in Pakistan. Family space, the anti-child marriage struggle, the struggle as it's located within the civil society organizations, which are trying to move for legislative reform and bureaucratic reform and implementation. In the community space, we have the Hazara Women's Collective. Market space, we have home-based women workers. These are mostly trade unions based out of Karachi and Hyderabad. In the state space, we have Aurat March, or rather the various provincial and city chapters of the Aurat March. So we're looking at all of these. And different countries have their own sort of case selection, but we've tried to kind of pull together as many sort of common themes as possible. Just a very quick slide to give you a sense of what we're looking at when we mean by backlash. It's a very wide spectrum. So because the forms of organization and collectivization are so diverse, interestingly, we also want to see what backlash looks like, and it seems like it looks very, very diverse. So we've kept that also very open-ended. It's a wide canvas. Ultimately, the project is, however, not about backlash. It's really, like I said, about re-strategizing in the face of backlash. So we're really interested in understanding the strategization and re-strategization process. All right, 30 seconds. Qualitative methods. So we've got a whole range of very interesting tools and instruments we're using. We've got the typical key informant interviews, focus group discussions, but we also have more sort of, let's say, humanities-based or more sort of subjective sort of tools like oral history, which are, you know, interviews which are co-constituted by the interviewer and the interviewee. We also have a very interesting thing called a struggle diary, and this is where the panel data comes in. So it's not the sort of panel data which you know, we acquire through sort of different rounds of interview collection after, let's say, 2 or 3 years. It's actually much more continuous than that. So we get a continuous stream of data on a quarterly basis. We go back to certain people and we ask them about what has happened in the past 3 months, asking very pointed questions once again about backlash, re-strategization, so on and so forth. The last point being about a reflective workshop, which is a very interesting qualitative method pulled from anthropology, where we're talking about body work and theater and using that to help these struggles and movements actually articulate and talk about their strategies, helping them make what we refer to as a strategy map. And I'm going to stop there, and thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here and to learn from everyone else. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kate, Dr. Rabia, and Mariam. We're very lucky to have Dr. Rachel Glennerster here with us as our keynote speaker. It is my absolute privilege to introduce her. Dr. Rachel is an associate professor of economics at the University of Chicago. She served previously as the Chief Economist for the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, the UK's Ministry for International Development. She has also been the executive director of JPAL and the lead economic academic for Sierra Leone at the IGC. As a development economist, Dr. Rachel's research focuses on randomized trials around health, education, microcredit, women's empowerment, and governance. Let's put our hands together to give her a very warm welcome, Dr. Rachel.
Thank you so much. It's really great to be here. And I feel a little embarrassed about talking about gender in Pakistan because none of my research has actually been on gender in Pakistan. But I'm hoping to bring some insights from both my time in the policy world and as an academic, and also working on gender issues. It's always slightly funny to me to be introduced as a policymaker. I obviously was a policymaker for a number of years, but I'm also an academic. So what I'm going to give you is some thoughts from kind of the interface between those two worlds. And in particular, I want to start off with why study gender, which maybe we don't need to talk about in this group because you've already decided to study gender, but I think it's useful to think about where we can add value. And then I'm going to talk to both the academics and the policy people in the room by saying, you know, where do I think from a policy perspective it's important to have more empirical research from people who take data very seriously, and where the policy world needs that. But then also give some thoughts about where academics could do a lot better in being influential in the policy world. So, why study gender empirically? As I say, I'll go through this relatively fast because you're probably aware of all of this. But at a very broad level, the first reason to study gender is that you will miss important trends if you just look at an aggregate, right? If you just looked at labor force participation in Mexico, for example, you would think that it was just flat. Whereas actually what's happening is that female labor force participation is going up and male labor force participation is going down. As a policymaker, that's a whole different issue than just saying it's flat. Another area where I think it's really important to disaggregate by gender is in education, where I've done a lot of work. And I want you to just, quickly look at that graph and see that the narrative is often about girls not going to school and out-of-school girls. If you look globally, there are actually as many boys out of school as there are girls out of school. But it varies dramatically by the level of education and where in the world you're talking about. So again, understanding those differences is really important as we try and think about how to get more children in school. So, most of the boys out of school, where there's, it's worse for boys is in the Americas and to some extent in Eastern Europe. A second reason to worry about gender is that a lot of the big economic decisions that are not made by individuals, they're made by households. So, where to live, whether to buy land, how many children to have, these are kind of decisions that are made in a family, and different people in the family will have different views about them. And there's strong evidence that the standard economics way of thinking about households doesn't work. It's not that they work as a very effective single unit. You can't think of them as single unit. You've got to break the family apart. Sorry, you don't literally want to break the family apart, but you want to understand what's going on lower down. And there's a lot of empirical evidence that we're not optimizing, we're not doing, as a household, people aren't doing what's optimal within the household. They're not bargaining effectively within the household. A topic close and dear to my heart is marriage, and the fact that we haven't done enough work as empirical researchers, both economists and political scientists, on marriage. Marriage is the largest economic decision anybody will make. And yet we have very little analysis about it compared to its size. So you can think about that in terms of dowry, and that gives a very clear, indicator of the size of the decision. But that's also true of, even in countries where there isn't dowry, you're still making a decision to join economic forces with someone and make collective decisions for a long period of time. Right? That is a huge economic decision, and yet if you look at economics, there's a very small literature on marriage. So we really need to change that. And it's also the case, it's not just about that decision, but anticipating that decision has led to, there's evidence, leads to changes in investments early on. So you're predicting what the marriage market is going to do influences whether you invest in education for girls, for example. And then, as I hinted at earlier, we have a lot of evidence of inefficiencies as a result of not investing similarly in women's and men's employment or their production. So these are just some statistics from Africa where it's very easy to see the inefficiencies because women and men will, particularly in West Africa, will invest in different bits of land. And so you can see that all the fertilizer goes on the man's bit of land and none of the fertilizer goes on the women's bit of land. And that's just inefficient, right? If you wanted to maximize production, because fertilizer, there's diminishing returns, you would spread the fertilizer over both plots. So it's very easy to measure in West Africa, but we think the same thing is true in lots of other countries. You know, if you invest all your, you send boys to school and not girls, well, maybe the girl is the most academically minded of the kids. That's just inefficient as a household decision. And the size of these inefficiencies can just really be quite large. You know, in Africa, it's sort of 7% increase in GDP if you just had better spread of investment across these different productions. Okay, so why does the policy world need the kind of work that you've just heard about? Well, I could talk for this for hours, but I'll just run through some top ones. One is that the impact of policies are often not at all obvious. So when I first started working in India, there was this policy of quotas for women at the local level, at the panchayat level, but there was a perception that it was having no impact. And time after time, I would go into communities that had a woman leader, a reserved position for women. You would go in and you would ask to talk to the panchayat head. It would be a woman. You go try and talk to her, and she'd say, no, don't talk to me, talk to my husband. I don't make any decisions. I know I'm the person who, but it's not really me. And this happened so much that people really thought that this was not having an impact. But looking quantitatively at what was actually happening on the ground in those villages, you found that those women were saying they didn't have any influence, but boy, were they having an influence, right? So you have to be really careful to because women don't want to admit always that they're having as much influence as they are. So you can underestimate the impact of policies or overestimate them, but unless you look at the data, you may get it very badly wrong, and I think this is a very good example where looking at the data, the villages that were randomized to get a women's leader were very different and responded to and reflected the needs of women. Interestingly, and we'll come back to this, what women cared about in different parts of India were very different. But the villages were always responding to whatever the needs of women were in that part of India. Okay, you don't have to read any of this table. But it is the results of a project that I have been doing for many years in Bangladesh on child marriage. And we looked at the impact of an empowerment program and of an incentive to delay marriage on marriage age. And we found that the incentive was quite effective in reducing child marriage. In fact, it was so effective that it was kind of surprising. And so we thought a lot about why that might be the case. And we ended up concluding, and we have a paper just about to come out, we hope, concluding that the reason is that actually men don't mind marrying women who are older, but society has got into this signaling game where men want to marry docile women or women who are not going to break conservative conventions. And they don't know how to select those women, but they use education as an indicator that if you want to stay in education, you probably are a slightly more empowered woman and therefore not so great on the marriage market. They actually like education. They like more educated women, but they're trying to sort to find women who are not, you know, gutsy. And the gutsy women are more likely to stay in education. So that, but if you can give them if you can give families a reason to keep girls in school that is nothing to do with the type of woman, you say, they point to the incentive and say, well, my girl is getting married later, but that's not because she's not conservative. We were just paid for that. So it's nothing to do with the type of woman. That is actually, we think, and we have a bunch of evidence in the paper on it, that that's actually what's going on. And that's like not what you would think without really delving into the data. Perceptions often lag reality. So, you know, a lot of the rhetoric and worry in the policy community about COVID and dropout from school has been that girls will drop out. And that is the case in many places. But actually, increasingly, the data is showing that boys are suffering more from the closure of schools. Not everywhere, but this is data from Ghana, and boys are not returning to school, whereas girls are because they started work. So when we talk about gender, we need to be careful to make sure that we're looking at both genders and looking at what the data says about who benefits and who doesn't. It's just different, right? You've got to look at gender. We shouldn't always assume. And I can't tell you how many times I've corrected where people assume that women are the worse off gender. It's not always the case. So we just have to go with the data. Cost effectiveness and scale, I think this is an absolute key question when we are looking, you know, both as researchers and policymakers. There's really not a lot of point in trying to evaluate something that you can't do at wide scale. Or as a funder, trying to implement a policy that you can only do at small scale. And this is something as a policymaker I banged on again and again and again about, because unfortunately, a lot of gender programs worry about all the complexity of gender, which is absolutely true, and therefore think that they have to deal with absolutely all the problems that women are facing, or men are facing. And then you get very complicated projects that you can't do at scale. And we're not going to move the needle on the issues that women and men are facing unless we can do things at scale. So always think from the beginning, even if you're doing a pilot project, can I do this at scale? Or am I learning something that I can then use to influence policy at scale? But you've always got to have scale in your mind. And I think this is a problem I came across all the time in policy. You know, as donors, we would fund small pilot projects and then hope that somebody else would scale them up. But if they were a program that couldn't be done by the government or couldn't be done by a very large scale, why were we even doing the pilot project? And I do think that the gender community it suffers from this problem. Lots of other communities in development do too, but it's a particular problem, I think, in gender. Okay, where as economists can we do better, or as quantitative researchers? You know, I've said all the reasons that policymakers should listen to us, but what do we need to do better to be listened to? Well, the first is we really have to fix our language, right? There is a huge problem of economists using terms that other people working in the gender space don't understand or misunderstand, and we fail to understand what other disciplines are talking about. I have tried in my work on gender to learn some of those terms. I am no way am I there yet, but let me just talk about some of the things that I've learned. So, you know, if you look at the definition of empowerment, which is the part of gender I've done most work on, It is the process by which those who have been denied the ability to make strategic life choices acquire such an ability. That is not women working, right? That's a whole different thing. It might be part of empowerment, it might not be part of empowerment, but don't say you're working on empowerment if all you're measuring is women's involvement in the labor force, right? It's about, or even girls going to school. Like a girl might go through medical school because her parents gave her no other option to do another subject at school. That ain't empowerment, right? So you can't measure it by the level of education. So I have a paper on sort of how do you measure it, and where we try and look at these different terms that are used in the empowerment community and how can you turn those into quantitative measures. But, you know, resources means something completely different to economists and those working on gender. Empowerment is too often used imprecisely, not by the wider known definition. Measuring too often as economists or empirical researchers, we measure end results rather than the process of getting there. Was a woman really involved in the process of getting there? And even if you're looking at outcomes, which is part of empowerment, try and talk about the process as well by which that was achieved. Improving measurement of empowerment, as I say, I've written a lot about this, and we spent ages working on it in the Bangladesh study. But this idea that empowerment is a process, it is possible to measure a process, right? I've done research where we called a community meeting and then observed how a decision was made and counted how many women spoke and how long. So it's possible to measure. It's hard, but it's possible. And there are a lot of different ways to think about how to do it. But this matters because you've got to measure what it is that women want and not what we think they ought to want. Empowerment's susceptible to reporting bias, so that's another problem that we have to be really careful about. And it means different things in different contexts. So as I say, different parts of India, women wanted different things, so you can't just look at the outcomes without understanding what it is that women in that community wanted to see change. My third piece of advice to the researchers in the room is to try and fill the gaps that are useful for policymakers. So we've done a lot of work as economists on the idea of, disproving the unitary household hypothesis, i.e. the fact that men and women within the household might want different things and they don't bargain efficiently. That's not something a policymaker can take away and do something about. It's important to understand because it tells us there's an inefficiency, but kind of the so what is, like, that's something we always talked about in DFID and FCDO is, somebody would talk about it and then they're like, yeah, but what's the so what? What is the thing that you want me to do tomorrow differently, and what is it you want me to do? You've got to take policymakers to that conclusion from your research. Complementarities is something which we've already heard quite a bit today about. You've got to worry about these different barriers to women, and Kate, you talked about, if you just do training, it doesn't work, but if you need to do some other things with the training, well, just be really careful before you advise that to policymakers. Because very complicated programs are very hard to do. And in the gender community, there's a view that, gender is very complicated. Absolutely. Barriers are complicated. There are multiple of them. Absolutely. That doesn't actually necessarily mean that just doing one thing won't change things. And we have not been very good as empirical researchers at precisely measuring complementarity, i.e., do you really get more from doing A and B together than you would get from A, doing A here and B here and adding the two together? And it is only if you get complementarity that you should advise a policymaker to do multiple things, because it is extremely hard to pull those projects off, and you get left with little projects that work in, 15 villages and don't change the world. And we're about changing the world, so we have to do things at scale. So test for complementarities and be careful where you advise them. Measure things, measure costs, and measure how things scale and whether they still work when they're at scale. And just remember this point that I've been saying, that while I'm an economist, it's not all about economics outcomes. Now, that is true of most of the economists I know working on gender, but it is still a perception of economists that we are only interested in economic outcomes as opposed to, decision-making processes or well-being or, wider versions of empowerment. So let's keep pushing back against that view. So just in conclusion, I tried to leave 5 minutes for questions. I don't know whether the organizers are going to let me do that. But, it's important to study gender empirically. There's lots of areas of gender policy that could really do with some good hard facts in there. Causal, yes, but descriptive also. Just, how much worse off are women or are men actually worse off in this dimension? We've made progress in measuring empowerment, but we have a long way to go. And I think most importantly, check your language. Try and use the language that is going to resonate with the audience you have in front of you, which is going to vary, but at least we certainly need to do a better job of talking across different disciplinary boundaries. Okay, great. So I should have warned you at the beginning so you could be thinking of your questions. Yeah.
Thank you for this. This is very interesting, and it's a lot to think about, what you've said about policy and empirical outcomes and stuff. What stuck with me is empowerment. You talked about how empowerment is not just the simple concept. It has many dimensions and many layers to it. But when we're trying to study it, or when we have an empirical study, or if we have like a lab in the field or an RCT, we're looking at one aspect of it, and that's how we try to define it in our paper. Like, that's how we try to set the stage. This is how we're defining empowerment, and this is how we're trying to measure it. But I feel like from what I heard from you, it seems like a little bit problematic. Like, there's more to empowerment, so are we trying to oversell what we're doing, or how do we define what we're trying to do without making it sound like it's all empowerment?
Yeah, so I would go back to this definition. So the process by which those who have been denied the ability to make strategic life choices acquire such an ability. So what that is about is saying, and how you turn that practically into measurement is to say, what are the things that, say we're looking at women, what are the things that they would like to do that they can't do? So they're being denied the ability to make strategic life choices, right? Where is it that they would like to make life choices that they feel constrained currently? And that may not be what you think is important. But part of it is kind of checking your view about what women ought to think. And then if you've done enough research on that is a key constraint here, then you can say, well, that's the thing that I want to measure, and you don't have to measure multiple things. We normally measure, several, but you can hone in on the thing which women are saying is a problem. And you might be saying, okay, I'm focusing on education, but then what is it that they would like to do within education that they can't do? In our Bangladesh study, we were really looking across a whole range of sectors, but we spent months asking that question: what does an empowered girl look like? What would you like to do that you can't do? And if you think, and the Quotas for Women paper is another really good example of that. You start by asking what women, where they're being constrained, and then you can focus in on those things. The other thing I would say is getting some sense of the process is also really important. You want at least some indicators that are about how you got to the outcome, because that's inherent in what empowerment is about. It's not just the final outcome, but something about the process. So, the DHS has all these questions, and you can argue with them about how well they do in capturing it, but about who makes decisions. So that's what I mean by getting something in the process. I'm not saying you always have to jump to what we did in Sierra Leone, of like observing a community meeting, but you need some measure of process. Does that answer?
So we have one question from an online participant. Alia, please go ahead and unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you very much. Rachel, it was a pleasure listening to you. I'm a retired professor of economics from Quaid-e-Azam University, and I've done a lot of work and supervised research on labor force participation of women. And I would just like to, add that there are channels of empowerment that might not be that direct, but if you tease the data a little bit, they are evident. So an example is interspousal communication of in the woman's household. That has seen to have a large effect on whether a woman or a girl can continue her education or continue employment. And this is from the Pakistan Standard Living Measurement Survey, which has a specific module on decision making regarding continuation of education or employment. So just for the young researchers out there, that it's not only for economists to probe that data set, but other social science researchers working on gender should look into such modules as well. So thank you very much.
Yeah, and something I think it's worth saying in our Bangladesh work, I said that the incentive had an impact on early marriage. The empowerment program didn't have any discernible impacts shortly after the end of the program, but many years later, it did have an impact on women generating income, and part of the program was exactly about that. How do you navigate, teaching women how to navigate and advocate within the family for what they wanted to do. So, again, women had said they wanted to participate more in the labor force or earn income in some way. Often it was still inside the house. But, again, it's not for me to say you have to be out earning income outside the house for it to count. And that program did, many years later, provide benefits because it was exactly doing that by helping women navigate the complexities of negotiation within the household. Anyone else? I realize we're at time, but.
So please go ahead, Khabar Mumtaz.
It's been, first of all, a very, very interesting look from an economist's point of view to look at policy, gender policy, which should be looking at process as much as the outcomes. So that's very, very important, I think, and it's a good point to be made. I was just thinking, when we're talking about issues of gender, like education, for instance, and you also provide incentives. For instance, there have been programs for middle school and high school incentives for girls, monetary incentives. But it has to be matched by the supply side. You might give an incentive to a household for sending girls to school, but you don't have schools that where girls can go easily to or accessible. So I think the importance of policy is addressing gender is a multi-sectoral policy decisions. So what we do is that we take up a policy and go to the Women's Development Ministry, for instance, or you go to a specific one for health, but we're not looking at the overall picture which facilitates the uptake of that incentive, for instance. So how do we, because we're talking about policy impact and policy advice. So when we're making that policy advice decision, I think we'll have to factor in all these aspects and focus on who will be able to change that overall or make interventions for the overall outcome.
Yeah, I completely agree.
It's just a comment.
Yeah, I completely agree though with the idea that some interventions won't work because people may be constrained on some other dimension. But I think I guess I'm just getting people to test that, because there may be people who are constrained, but in this case, and maybe it was particular to the Bangladesh environment, but you did see families were able to respond to the incentive by marrying later, and as a result, many girls stayed on in school longer. Interestingly, most incentives to delay marriage are tied to education, and in our case, it wasn't. And you actually saw delayed marriage even for girls who are out of school at the start of the program, which frankly none of us thought was going to work, because we thought once she's dropped out of school, she's going to get married because people are worried, will she become tainted, etc. But, again, the data speaks and you get surprised, which is always the funnest bit of research. And we found that even girls who are out of school responded, or their parents responded to the incentive and delayed their marriage.
I think we can carry on with the question and answer session during our networking lunch. So we'd already like to thank Dr. Rachel, and I'd like to invite Maroof Sayyed to present a small token of appreciation to Dr. Rachel. I'm sorry about the limited space on the stage here.